I am pretty much a self-taught practitioner in radiomics because my formal background is mainly exclusively medicine and radiology. But as I finished my residency and started my PhD, radiomics was getting so that's how I saw about it. I read about it and I became interested in it, and so having already an interest in computer science and informatics and some expertise in programming, I pretty much picked it up and I started working. Radiomics is it's a tricky question, because actually the term radiomics, when it was first introduced, came to label techniques that were even very old. If you look on PubMed, there's even papers dating back to the 70s and 80s using texture analysis and what we would now define as radiomics even back then. Obviously, with the growing of digitalization in medicine and radiology in particular, and the availability of computing power, now it is fairly easy and accessible compared to then. Pretty much radiomics, in my eyes, comes to encompass all quantitative image analysis that produces highly dimensional data sets. So a large number of what we will call radiomic features, which can usually be derived from text analysis. But there is a wide overlap with machine learning in general, because all the deep learning networks that are currently used, in fact, use radiomic features. Just they are extracted within the network, and we don't see what the network is actually doing. So radiomics in general is a general term for quantitative analysis of highly dimensional feature datasets from medical imaging, including deep learning and machine learning in general. This is also a challenging question, because the potential, the what we would all aspire to, is that radiomics and machine learning could open new possibilities and open give us new avenues to bring value to healthcare through radiology. So allow us to obtain information that currently are not available from the images, or are not easily obtainable, or require high levels of expertise. In practice, I think that in the short and medium term, a more realistic goal is to lean on radiomics and machine learning to help us in improving the quality of life and speed up some of the more repetitive and let's say less interesting tasks, so that radiologists can be more fully dedicated to the more challenging aspects and more interesting aspects of the clinical practice. For example, rapid lesion measurements or segmentation, or aid in the detection of lesions, but not much in the characterization, because those topics are still, I think, too challenging for a widespread clinical adoption of predictive modeling. Those are fairly common in research, but the translation in clinical practice is, I think, it's still far away in a reliable manner. So I think in the short term, medium term, we should use these techniques to improve our quality of life and ease our burden on the tasks that we are not very interested in carrying out as radiologists. Yeah, those are the kinds of tasks, that I would, for example, I don't know, in multiple sclerosis, lesion load comparisons over time, or oncological patients, where you already know where the lesions are, or there might be something new, but you have to check lesion by lesion, or already have some software tools, but machine learning could surely improve on those that are currently used. Then in the long term, one would hope that with the development of the field, we could actually use these tools also to obtain additional information compared to what we currently can, for example, the genomic profiling of lesions or phenotypical profiling of lesions that we currently most commonly cannot do. But I think while that side is more interesting from a research perspective right now, it's the furthest away from a clinical practice point of view. On the other side, what is more interesting from a clinical practice point of view, these tasks, repetitive tasks and boring tasks and time-consuming tasks that are not challenging for the radiologists, those are the ones that are actually less interesting from a research point of view, and maybe there's less incentive on publishing on those topics because they're less glamorous and one has less opportunity to have a high visibility with those efforts. It's not driving the innovation, but I think it's where radiomics can find an easier application in the short and medium term. What is driving the research are more high concept works, but those I think are more challenging to actually implement. I think those are where the attention is focused, but those applications I think are still very far in the future in a credible manner. So there is a disconnect between where the research is focused and maybe even the funding is going, and where I think radiomics can actually make a clinical impact in the short and medium term. So in the next 5 years or 10 years. Maybe I hope I was clear enough, because when you're modeling for genotypical aspects or stuff like that, it's very challenging to reproduce those results across the board and have a product that's actually easily implementable everywhere in the world, because the settings and it's incredibly different. And then even when you obtain something that's actually good, then maybe even you go in an institution, they change their scanner down the 3 years in the future, and you have to start over pretty much. On the other hand, there are simpler tasks, like lesion segmentation, easy markers that are even more easy to verify from the radiologist's point of view, because you can actually see the output and check the output in real time. And in that case, then that's easier to implement, but it's less interesting because it's less glamorous from a research and academic point of view. And even from a funding point of view, it's more challenging to obtain good interest in research in that field. So I think there is a disconnect between what can actually be done right now and what we would like radiomics and machine learning to do in the future. From my point of view, at my department, it was true that there was a high increase, for example, in chest X-rays and chest CT. But it was also true that unfortunately there was also a decrease in many other areas. So pretty much the overall amount of activity was increased, but not too much. It was just that it was our resources were focused differently, more on chest exams and stuff like that. Regarding the impact of radiomics, I think not much radiomics, which could help in speeding up the reporting of exams like that. I think machine learning in this setting could be useful in one of the sites not tied to image analysis, but because machine learning also has some models and some approaches that have been used to improve, for example, patient prioritization and management of triaging and waiting lists. So in the setting of an increased demand of radiology, that's due to COVID right now, but maybe due to other reasons in the future, or we would like to provide a greater amount of exams or improve how we provide exams, I think machine learning could have a role in that space. Obviously, it would require digitalization of healthcare databases, providing some of the information about the patients to allow a correct selection of which patients should have easier access or earlier access to the exams. So that's also a delicate and challenging topic, but I think that's a space in which machine learning could help, because it's something that's already done in other areas where machine learning has already been applied in other areas, less critical than healthcare, but there is a good experience in this kind of work in other fields. Patient triaging and prioritization of the exams, yeah. So helping in managing the resources. When the demand is higher than the resources, machine learning can help in the distribution, correcting the distribution of the resources to avoid that people that should access healthcare, radiology in this case, are left out because there's too much demand at this moment. I think it can help in order to help clinical practice and imaging interpretation and review. I think the AI solutions should be as integrated with the current software we already use for imaging reporting as currently available. So PACS systems, visualization systems, and reporting systems. This is true in part for some software. I have seen examples of some solutions that work together with PACS vendors, for example, and they provide a good integration with modules within the viewing system, and even in some cases automatically filling up some of the parts of the reporting, and that would be the ideal situation. Also, because usually these software have a very practical application, like talked about before. For example, lesion detection and measurements of lung nodules or brain aneurysm or stuff like that, volumes of brain hemorrhage, and those are easy for the radiologist to double check on the fly. So we are using the software, the Radiomics software, the machine learning software. We have its output integrated within our clinical workflow, and it's easy for us for these applications to see that the algorithm is actually working as intended, so we can easily trust the output of the model. This ties up a little bit to what I said before. That's, I think, focusing on these kind of tasks also eases the introduction of these tools in practice, because it's easier for radiologists to trust something that they can actually verify immediately. When you have outputs that refer to information that has to be obtained then after surgery or down the line in prognosis after 10 years, it's very challenging for someone who doesn't know how the system works or hasn't worked on developing it to actually trust what it's outputted, and to integrate it in a report, then he or she has to sign and take responsibility for, because that's the other aspect of the matter. To ease the interaction should be as seamless as possible. So not using external software as much as possible, not having to use a dedicated workstation as much as possible, to ease it and have a really widespread adoption, not leave it, confined to niche areas or specific experts. I think it should be really made as easily accessible as possible. So the interaction has to require as little action from the radiologist as possible, just an overview of what the output is, and in this, using outputs that are easily verifiable by the radiologist without a complex technical knowledge would be useful. No, it's either you have to see how the model is working, which is challenging because it's not possible in most cases actually, or the output is something that easy to understand. So, for example, I can see if the software detects a nodule and measures it, I can see what the measurement is and where the nodule is located. So it's easy for me to verify that it acted correctly. So even if I don't know how it actually detected the nodule and how it performed the measurement, I see it's correct and I trust it. And then that trust can build to introduce more complex tasks where we can start trusting it a little bit more and delegate and take a step back, even if this is also a challenging balance, because you don't want to get to the point where you actually let the algorithm work completely unsupervised. So there's another side of the medal there, because you want to build trust, but not too much trust, because you always want someone to actually check what's going on. It's similar to what's happening, for example, in self-driving cars. It's something that has been promised for many years. Even now, there's lots of software and aids and things like that, but they always require a driver and someone who has their hands on the wheel. And even when the car is in the perfect conditions on the highway with low traffic, it's always an amount of supervision is always required, and no one would ever suggest using the car without any kind of supervision. The same thing is applicable in healthcare and radiology. It's the same. Actually, it's probably equally dangerous, because it's always a life and death situation in both cases, because you can have a car accident, or you can misdiagnose a lesion or not see a lesion, and it's equally dangerous. The software, I think, well, as I said, if you want to do, if one want to dig into how the inner workings of the software, this should be made as available as possible. For example, seeing feature distribution, so seeing how the model is built. So if the model uses specific features, it could provide some information on how these features are distributed within the lesion of interest, and maybe in the training database it was used, and give some insight on how it arrived to a conclusion. For deep learning, you can have activation maps to see where in the image the attention of the model was focused. So if one wants to have some information, it should be available, because maybe there can be some doubt on the output. But at the same time, I said the front facing for the end user and most general user, I think it should be as simple as possible. So the information can be accessible, but it should not be mandatory to look at it, because it can get too complex for the general user. And if it has to become something that we use routinely, it should not be expected that one has to get to this level of detail for every exam. Otherwise, it becomes a hindrance instead of a value. So the opposite result of what we would want. Specific, then it's difficult to have, because it depends on the application of the model. So the ideal implementation depends on what we're, for example, if we're talking about prognosis, probably just having a probability and of an outcome, so evolution, progression of disease in 5 years or something like that could be useful information, but it would be pretty extraneous to what we usually report right now in radiology. It would not be easy to integrate this information within how we are used to right now report in our final reports of an exam. That's another point that probably requires a little bit of working on once these technologies are actually widespread. Any algorithm with radiomics, even if there is always a challenge tied to the amount of patients or lesions or instances in general that are available for the training of the model. So the main issue is that radiomics usually produces, by definition, a large amount of features, hundreds or even thousands of features for each case. And it's known that in machine learning in general, as in statistics, one cannot use the whole data set because the amount of noise is excessive. So as long as there is a correct pipeline prior to the implementation of the machine learning model, so there is a good feature reduction, and which can include feature stability, univariate analysis, multivariate analysis, dimensionality reduction with the principal component analysis, or even more complex algorithms for dimensionality reduction, which they themselves could be machine learning algorithms, but unsupervised ones. Then pretty much any model, any kind of model can be used. Actually, from a methodological point of view, but this is fairly well known in machine learning in general, it would always be preferable to start out using the simplest model available. So even a simple logistic regression or even a linear regression, and then build up from there. Because if we are able to obtain a similar performance with a simpler model, the simpler model should always be preferred, because the simpler model is also more easy to understand, more easy to verify that it's working correctly. As we go on increasing the complexity of the model, so with ensembling, with random forests, which are still fairly understandable, we can go to support vector machines that can get fairly complex. So deep learning, that's pretty much a black box, because even the explainability approaches are fairly limited in what they actually are able to explain. Then you usually can improve performance, but you have to pay a price in interpretability. So all the models can be used, and actually different models should be used, because then we have to use, we should select for the final implementation the simplest model that's able to obtain the results we wish. So the degree of accuracy that's considered acceptable, because this is a real advantage of simple models compared to deep learning. Today, there is not only in healthcare and radiology, but overall, a little bit of a tendency to go directly to deep learning for any kind of issue, because it's many of the people who are starting out now or who have started working in recent years often have mainly devoted their studies on deep learning, and so they have a little bias towards deep learning. And deep learning is also more hyped, and it's more complex, and it requires higher computing power. So it's a little bit more glamorous. So there is a tendency to I think overshoot in the beginning 5 phases of research directly to deep learning, rather than starting out with simpler models that would be probably more correct from a research point of view, and even from a practical implementation point of view. I don't know if I went a little bit out of the topic, but I think in comparing the various models, this can be useful. There may be cases which actually deep learning is indicated, even if the amount of data that we usually have in radiology is not comparable to what is available for deep learning in other tasks. So deep learning models have reached a prominence in other fields, but with datasets being constituted of millions of entries, while in radiology and medicine, usually we have tens or hundreds of patients. When we have hundreds of patients, we are already happy because we have a rich dataset. But in actual numbers, if you compare those numbers with what is available, for example, in ImageNet or in other datasets like that, it's nothing. It's pretty much a drop in the ocean. So in general, just to summarize, all models are fine. One should start out simple and add complexity only if actually necessary after experimentation, not just start out with deep learning, because that's what the trend is right now in research. So trend, it can be useful, but it should not be, I think deep learning should never be the first choice. Should always be just, the introduction of deep learning should always be justified by a need for a more complex model that pays a price in terms of interpretability. Just to summarize. But also deep learning, in theory, deep learning by design uses a large amount of parameters, and that's already questionable when the number of data from which those parameters are derived is small, because it augments the risks of bias and false results and unreliable results. So easier models, because you can also use deep learning on features that have been extracted, let's say by hand by manual analysis of the images. So it's deep learning is not only constituted by CNNs that extract the features themselves from the images, even if those are what's mostly used today. So on that, I agree. But deep learning, yeah, it's pretty much uses the use of deep learning has to be justified from prior experience. One should always use a first model and then demonstrate, or if they're using deep learning, should also use a reference model, a simpler model, and because when even in other fields, when this has been done, not always deep learning was actually the best solution. Random forests, even today, and even SVMs, or even logistic regressions in many tasks, even in other fields, are actually still competitive with deep learning. Only when the amount of data becomes actually overwhelming, and even there, it still has to be demonstrated and experimentally, deep learning gains the upper hand unequivocally. So I think in radiology, we have not yet, let's say, reached that level of saturation of the classical model or simpler models uh, that require deep learning to obtain an improvement of what we're currently doing. I think the results that are reported right now, many cases are still obtainable with simpler methods that are even easier both to diffuse to help the spread of these methods, because more understandable results are more easy to present and to propose to people who are not maybe directly involved in the field, and one can then build up on those, and then once large enough data sets are actually available, then deep learning can probably become viable for more complex tasks that are not yet doable right now. Those factors can influence the selection of the model, but mostly in terms of the availability of data. Because some modalities, for example, X-rays, it's easier to collect very large databases, and usually there should be less variation, for example, from site to site, stuff like that. For other modalities, for example, ultrasound, those can vary greatly even within a site, because maybe each operator uses different settings and changes the way that the images are acquired, and can introduce biases that are not visible to the human eye but become relevant when analyzing quantitatively the images. But in general, I don't think there is a direct correlation between a specific imaging modality or organ kind of lesion and the preferred machine learning algorithm. I think the choice of the algorithm depends more on the task that we have in mind, because obviously, if we're talking about lesion detection, then we need an algorithm that works on the images directly, and so usually deep learning is justified in that case because it's the easiest way to implement that. If we want lesion characterization or other things like that, then not necessarily we have to use deep learning in those cases, but it's not much the organ or modality, it's more the aim and the kind of data set that we have to work with. So this is also because there is not one preferred metric, even if there are some specific metrics that are more commonly used for some tasks. For example, in segmentation, the DICE score, which is the same as the F1 score that's used in classification, and so on. One of the challenges is actually that often researchers, especially those not with a medical background, so they come from different fields, they are used to reporting even just the AUC or one metric that's used as the reference. This may be in part justified by their background, because usually coming from a more technical side of things, they're used to during the machine learning pipeline to focus on a metric that becomes the reference metrics, and the metric, and then it's used then for the tuning of the model, and within the model training process and development process to optimize the model and its hyperparameters and the whole pipeline. So they have this kind of usually this attention often to focus on this the word doesn't come to me right. They usually have this tendency to focus on a single metric and then report only that metric within their paper. Regarding, well, both, even this is also in my topic in the talk. Research, usually what we expect more is actually, especially in medicine in general, we're more used to having more metrics available, and often even the tools to obtain additional metrics reported in the paper. For example, reporting the entire confusion matrix instead of just derived metrics, so that if one wants to obtain additional information, or even allow for meta-analysis and other types of studies which aggregate data in a different manner, that information is actually necessary to be able to perform those analyses. For example, in my experience, we did perform 2 meta-analyses on machine learning papers, and in both cases, we had to limit our pooling of accuracies to AUC data, because the raw data of the test sets was not available otherwise. So there is a widespread issue of not presenting the entirety of the results that are actually obtainable. So that's the main issue. Then the metrics in of themselves. The other issue is also that usually researchers tend to stay more general. So, for example, providing the AUC as a general accuracy metric, but then they don't always test in a more prospective manner, which doesn't mean specifically only a prospective study, but actually even an experiment of clinical implementation with a specific cutoff and providing, for example, a specific confusion matrix with true positive, false positives, and so on, because that would be more informative. Because from a clinical point of view, it's the specific metrics gain different value based on the problem that we are discussing. So if it's a screening program, then maybe we could accept a little bit more false positives if it means we are not missing significant lesions. Providing only the AUC gives us no information on that side of things. So we may know that the accuracy in general is good, but we don't know how the distribution of the patients in practice is, and if we're actually, we might prefer a lower accuracy, but a better negative predictive value, for example, in this case. But I wouldn't focus on expecting a specific metric from each paper. I think it's better to ask for as much information as possible, because I think that's the only way to go forward and actually have reliable results and build trust in the systems. As long as we're only providing one metric, it can always give the impression of being cherry-picked and selective reporting, which only feeds the doubts that some people have towards these techniques. And even if it is the best metric, it's always a limited amount of information. So I think one should ask always for as much information as possible. So the pure confusion matrix and all the metrics that are possible to be reasonably obtained, obviously, without going overboard. I don't mean that everyone who presents a single metric does so malevolently, let's say. There is also a perspective, because when they don't have a clinical background, as I said, often during the development process, usually you have to select one metric, for example, during cross-validation, that becomes the reference metric. And so there is a tendency, machine learning developers and engineers and researchers, to exclusively focus on that metric. But that metric alone, obviously, at the end of the process, when one wants to hypothesize what the clinical applicability of the result is, of the resulting model is, that metric alone does not obviously give the full picture. because we may be interested in that metric. It may even be the most appropriate metric for that problem. But having the field confusion matrix, not only the negative predictive value, but also the positive through negative to positive, all the metrics, the basic metrics that are obtainable, that gives us a better picture and helps us even understand if there are some problems that maybe were not obvious to the researchers because maybe they did not have the required clinical background, or they overlooked it, because it can happen. So having as much information as reasonably possible is always preferable. So it's not always, I don't think it's done, in some cases it's surely done malevolently and because one wants to present better results than what's actually true. But in general, the solution for both cases, so for both those that maybe make a mistake in faith and those that bad faith, is to require from the part of the journals and the readers and the reviewers, require that all the metrics that are reasonably obtainable are produced and allow a complete evaluation of what the actual result is. I hope this was maybe more clear. If I'm a reviewer, usually I ask for the confusion matrix as a requirement for the assessment of the paper. If I am a reader, as I said, I did perform 2 meta-analyses, one on meningiomas and one on prostate cancer. And in that cases, we had no other choice than to focus exclusively on the AUC values, because that was the only metric that was reported consistently. And most of the papers only reported that metric. Obviously, this is not ideal because, for example, in prostate cancer, we already know that magnetic resonance imaging has a high negative predictive value. Also, maybe if I'm developing a model for the detection of lesions, I would be interested in a model that has a high positive predictive value, because then that complements better what we're already able to do as radiologists. But that both requires some expertise from behind the research, or the availability of the sufficient information to assess that point from a reader point of view if the paper has already been published. But in any case, if it becomes standard practice to expect a thorough reporting of the results, these kind of papers, then the issue will resolve naturally over time, because that information will become available. We will be able to perform meta-analysis like we do in other fields using classical statistics, because we have come to expect this degree of information from clinical trials not using machine learning. It's not reasonable not to apply the same standards that we have always expected in other fields, not to apply also to machine learning. So it's not that because it's machine learning, we don't have to expect the same degree of information in the end result. And there will always be a limitation in machine learning, because unless the model itself is available for implementation, details on the preprocessing pipeline of the data, you will never be able to reproduce the result completely. But this is also not entirely relevant, because well, this is also something I will touch upon in my talk. But for example, from the psychology reproducibility crisis, one of the concepts that has emerged is that reproducibility should not be limited to the reproduction of the experiment in and of itself. So taking the pipeline, taking the code in the case of machine learning, having the data set, clicking and obtaining the same result. That is useful, but it's of limited use, because the idea is if the concept behind the study is sound. So if the idea at the basis of a prediction or a predictive model or a classification model or a regression model is sound, one should be able to obtain within a certain degree similar results, even approaching the problem slightly differently. Because if the information is there, in that type of exam, for that type of lesion, for example, if we're talking of pathologic patients, it's the most common application. Then even if I'm not using the exact same method, if the theory is good behind the experiment, I should still be able to obtain similar results because the information has to be there. Otherwise, if I am just modeling some random noise in my own data set that's not present in your data set or another group's data set, then I would never be able to reproduce. So I may be able, if I give you my data and my model, you will be able to reproduce those results. But those results are still not true or not supported by a real theory behind the experiment. So that's why it's because on one side, one would be, so we should present all the information to allow a good assessment of actually what's being produced by the model. But then it's reproducing the specific experiment is interesting up to a certain point because we should also aim to develop a more general understanding of what we're actually looking at in the images. So what those patterns actually mean, because if there is a pattern that is informative in that lesion, then it should be informative regardless within certain limits of how I'm looking at it or how I'm detecting it or how I'm classifying it. That signal should be there in any case. Then we could have a more optimal solution that gains a little bit better accuracy, a less optimal solution that's less accurate. But if the information is there, then it should be evident, even if we slightly diverge on the methods that we're using. So it's not the specific experiment, it's more what's behind the experiment. So if there's something real behind that experiment, then it should be something that comes up independently even from more groups, because there's something there that we're all looking at. So from a more immediate point of view, we should raise the standards of what we expect from machine learning research in radiology. This is a process that's already beginning because there have been checklists that have been developed by the editors and by journals that are more specific to machine learning research compared to more general research checklists, and that aid in ensuring that the correct amount of information is present in the paper, including, for example, the accuracy metrics that we talked about. Also, there has been a growing interest in various research groups, including my own, in the use of external tools to assess the quality of studies that have already been published. And the results of those efforts are usually not satisfying currently. So the quality is generally found to be always very low across the board, independently of the application. So there is a problem there. There is a small trend in improvement over the years, and we have to build upon that to obtain a greater improvement. So from in the short term, we have to continue raising the standards of publication, especially on the more prestigious journals that have the resources to implement more strict peer reviewing and even maybe involve a technical editor for the more methodological aspects that may not be known to a clinical reviewer that are usually involved in this process. Then, from a more general point of view, we should work on developing the theory behind radiomics and machine learning. So for now, usually how the research goes is you have an idea, you build a data set, and then you try to see if you're able to predict whatever you want to predict based on the idea you had in the region. But it's there's only a few groups have actually tried to work on the specific reasons on why a specific model works for one outcome or not, and there should be a greater effort in actually building up what is a good theory behind some of the applications of machine learning. So why it works for a specific aim that we have in mind. So if there is a large amount of data on a specific outcome, for example, as prostate imaging or breast imaging, there are some fields that have neuro-oncological imaging. There are some fields that already have a large amount of studies that have been published, but they're always very small and narrow in their overview. We should start having some works that try to aggregate this data and look at the bigger picture and try to develop a larger theory within each of these areas of why radiomics actually works or doesn't work for some of these aims. Obviously, this is very challenging, but in the long term, if we want to make radiomics actually a robust field, it should have some theory and some understanding on how it actually works in a more general sense, not only it works because it works practically and empirically and it stops there. Because something similar happened, for example, for brain functional imaging and brain connectivity, and there have been other areas in radiology where initial results then brought to building up a more robust theory on what's going on, for example, in the brain. So it is possible to move from a more practical aspect and quantitative results and more experimental science to a more theoretical, to build upon that to obtain a more theoretical understanding of what is happening biologically. So I think that's what we should aspire to as machine learning researchers. It might not be possible, but we should try at least. I think that in the next years, I think there will remain a high interest in radiomics for challenging tasks that cannot be achieved currently by radiologists. For example, genomic profiling, phenotypic profiling of lesions, and the prediction of outcomes at 10 years, and research that's already going on right now, and that will continue. What I hope is that there will be a greater attention to the more practical side of things and more easily obtainable results that are actually clinically implementable and could allow for a real application of these tools in practice. And so building up the trust between the radiologist and the tool, and even between the patient and the tool, and allow us even to develop the necessary regulation framework and legal framework, because having simpler tools that are more easily verifiable will open the door for all the rest. So I hope that this realization will become widespread, and in part, not much from the side of academia, but I think from the companies that are working in this area, there is already a greater degree of understanding that this is the way to get the foot in the door to speak. So, for example, even on the side of improving image quality and speeding up image acquisition in MRI, or lowering dose in PET and CT. So those are applications of deep learning to which we radiologists are less aware of, but companies are investing much on that side of things. That's more practical and easy to see and easy to verify if the image quality is still diagnostic and if the information that we are able to get from those images is still useful. So there is a tendency to go in that way from a commercial point of view, and I hope that will be a driving force for the rest of the field as well. The problems it will solve, I think, in the near future, in the next 5 years, will be more practical. So we have already mentioned, so speeding up the acquisition, easing the burden of repetitive and boring tasks. Not really, because radiology is fairly complex and fortunately too complex for now to be substituted by an automated tool. And if we're talking about well, if AI ever got to the point where it's able to substitute radiologists, then there will be other issues to address, because it will be able to substitute many other workplaces before radiology. So there will probably be a reorganization of society as a whole before that. And also in the field of medicine, there are actually, I think, other specialties that are more immediately at danger from AI. For example, pathologists and other specialties that are also analyze images or also have these kind of tasks, because in that case it's probably easier to develop tools that are that obtain similar results, because it's more straightforward and there's more homogeneity on the workflow. So I don't think the fear is justified even in the future. And as I said before, we're seeing what's happening even with self-driving cars. It's 10 years that self-driving cars are coming in the next 5 years. So the hope and the expectations of AI are always a little bit too high compared to what it actually is able to do practically. So obviously, med students, they might not have the knowledge sufficient both in radiology and in AI to correctly assess the situation, but until there is actually a shortage of radiologists, I would not worry much about it. No, I don't think so. It's also true that in many places now, in Italy, in southern Italy, a little bit more slowly than elsewhere. Um, Radiology is also becoming more and more active on the interventional side of things. So there's a whole side of radiology that's actually completely not interested in this problem, because the current applications of AI that are being proposed are completely ignoring the whole side of more practical side of things. I do not think. I think there would be more. There is a greater chance that maybe teleradiology and other technologies might reduce or redistribute the work in radiology prior to have an impact due to AI. And also because the tasks that AI can do, the most of the work that's done in radiology is in clinical practice in small centers, and it would be very limited. I expect a very limited impact in most settings. Most of the works that's being done right now, it's more aimed at higher levels of care and niche cases, or even in increasing the amount of exams that can be performed, which in turn would actually increase the demand for radiologists. Because if we are able to speed up, for example, MR imaging from 40-minute exams to 10-minute exams or 5-minute exams, then instead of acquiring 20 MR exams in one morning, then we could acquire 100 MR exams in one morning. Then we would probably need more people to actually report on those exams. I think it's very difficult to make predictions on this scale for now. That's challenging, because obviously, as for any topic, any product, it requires a whole side of work that's usually not seen by radiology, because you usually need computer science people and software engineers, because around the model, you have to develop a whole software infrastructure that allows both for the management of data, because you would input raw data, feed it to the model after the correct preprocess. So you have to implement the whole pipeline developed in the research setting, together with user interface and all the quality of life aspects, user software aspects, and integration with the current solution. So the challenge is that it will require the involvement of many other people from different disciplines, creating a company which includes different experience, or If you have an idea and a product and you're able to trademark it and register it, and you could go to a company and then use their expertise. For example, several vendors of medical scanners and technology are already doing that, maybe buying up smaller companies or working together with researchers to develop their own solutions. Because in actuality, there is already a large amount of software that's commercially available for radiology. There has been recently even a repository that was made and has also an accompanying paper published in European Radiology of 100 at the time of publication, but they have increased the number of a repository including all the solutions that already have either FDA approval and or European Community CA marking for medical use. So there is a large amount of software. It's challenging for a research group alone, probably would never reach that point without either expanding in a startup company and building up the necessary infrastructure, or working together with a company, a larger company that already has the necessary know-how. Regarding the let's say the concordance between the research aspects and the commercial aspects, this review highlighted, and there have been following papers by the same group that's working on this topic, highlighted how out of 100 commercially available solutions, the majority did not have any research supporting their performance. So when they come to propose you the product, there is actually no research. And of those that had research, 36% of that research, only, if I remember correctly, half of that research was independent of the vendor. So what was not directly authored or directly sponsored by the vendor of the software. So it's true that that the software are commercially available. It's probably not true that there is sufficient evidence to support the review currently. And we have no idea of the evidence that is present. We should also go and see what the actual quality of that research is, and if it's actually reliable and reproducible, and all the things that we have talked about in our previous questions and answers. So there are commercially available solutions. Some companies have also come to my institution to propose some of these. I think for now it's still too soon to implement them. Maybe some of the vendor solutions to speed up image acquisition, timing, and stuff like that. But otherwise, I would not trust. I would not invest any money in these solutions, because most often we are still we are early adopters, and in any technology, it's not always a good position to be in, because the early adopters also end up being beta testers, and they end up paying for the privilege of using something that's not yet optimally ready. So probably I would still wait a little bit more, and if I had to spend money at my department, if I was the head of the department and had to spend money, I would not invest it in AI products right now. There are still probably more justifiable expenses prior to spending on that area for now. Maybe in 4 or 5 years, they're more mature and more there is more evidence to support their use. But for now, I think it should still remain mainly in the research field. Their own studies, but they had no external auditing or external reviewing process, or so they present you the data, but you have to take it at face value, let's say. Peer review has its own issues, but they do obtain, but those that have the most often, those that have the approvals, they are only for technical feasibility, not for clinical impact. So they might have studies demonstrating that the results are reproducible and robust, but not that they have. If you want the numbers, I can look up the paper right now and give you, or even if you want, I can give you the reference of the paper that I mentioned. So actually, I know the paper fairly well because I wrote the accompanying editorial for it. So it came out together with the clear guidelines in European radiology, maybe last summer. I'm not sure. Fairly recent. It's a group, I think, the Netherlands, Belgium, and they also did a recent investigation focusing on the assessment of commercial solutions for stroke detection. And they also had some interesting findings there. So it's a group that's greatly focused on assessing commercially available machine learning solutions, and they bring up interesting points on these issues. So it's not that they don't have any evidence, it's just that it's not published, it's not openly available, and it has not undergone the classical external review process. They might have internal evidence that they might have produced to the legislative bodies, but and also the FDA approvals and the CE marking, as I said, they're usually at a lower level. They are clinical. They're not dangerous. They can be used clinically, but there's no proven, for most of them, there's no proven clinical impact or clinical value. And also the FDA approved software. I'm not sure how it works because I'm not based, as you know, in the United States. But as I understand, even there, usually they are more a lower level of approval, so they can be used, but they are not entirely. They're not fully approved fully endorsed, let's say. And in considering the United States, there's also a whole other discussion because, for example, just in the last months, there have been the first software solutions that have obtained billability, let's say, so they can be reimbursed by insurances. Because another issue, less in Europe, because in Europe usually it's all paid by the state, it most paid some form or another. There's always a public, at least in Italy, but there's always a public coverage of most of the expenses. But for example, there one of the questions is who pays for AI. So for example, if it's valuable in Italy, the hospital pays for it. So in the end, usually the state, the national healthcare system. In the United States, it's not so easy. So another challenge for which these companies are trying to get recognition is to actually be recognized by the insurance company and be reimbursable by the insurance companies. So that's a whole other challenge. So translating the research to the clinical practice and especially the commercial side of things, it's a whole other world. I'm not entirely expert on that world, I have to admit, but it's a whole other argument. It's very, very challenging in itself, and the products that are currently available are not extremely robust. I think they may work, but you have no way to actually demonstrate. And as far as I know, I don't know if there are any implementations of upkeep in time and guarantees if the data distribution changes at your institution. Who takes responsibility if the model stops working? Are there? Do they? Who covers the costs, for example, of retraining a model on updated data? It never ends. If you want to go into that side of things, we could talk, I think, for hours of the issues. It's pretty crazy. And I think, because this is something I will also say in my talk, but I am actually a believer in this technology. I think these technologies do work and can work and should be implemented in radiology in the future. It's just that probably right now we're going a little bit too fast, and this can be counterproductive in the long term because we are riding the hype wave right now, and if we run too fast to propose it and then they don't work or don't work as expected, then we would have a backlash and it would be negative in the long term, because I think these technologies do have some solid basis, and can be implemented correctly. So I do not wish to give the impression that I'm negative of the over these. I myself, I work mainly on this, so it would be critical of me to then say I do not believe they work. I do believe they work, but we should be very careful how we are implementing and developing.